World War to 1945, the British general smuggled through the Biesbosch Marsh. It was the last winter of the Second World War, and one of Britain's most senior generals was hiding in an attic in Holland with 3 Dutch women, a fake identity card, and a deaf badge that said he could not hear a question. He was about to be smuggled across a frozen wetland in a wooden boat by a man he had never met. Stay with this one, because most of the war was won by men whose names appear in books. But the last act of the Battle of Arnhem ended with a fisherman, a packet of cigarettes, and a journey through a swamp. John Winthrop Hackett was the kind of officer the British Army made on purpose, educated at Oxford, languages and history. Wounded in Syria, combat experience in North Africa. By 1944 he was a brigadier, close to the top of the British command, and he led the 4th Parachute Brigade. On the 18th of September 1944, Hackett dropped onto the Ginkels Heath outside Arnhem at the head of his men. The operation was called Market Garden. The plan was to seize the bridges along the Rhine and end the war in the West before Christmas. It went badly almost from the moment the boots hit the ground. By the 24th of September, the British paratroopers at Arnhem had been chewed apart. Hackett was seriously wounded. A shell fragment caught him in the stomach and the leg. He was carried to the St. Elizabeth Hospital in Arnhem, half occupied by German military doctors and half staffed by Dutch nurses. A British surgeon working at the hospital, also captured, opened him up and operated by lantern light. Hackett came out of the operation alive. By any reasonable medical standard, he should not have. He recovered enough to sit up. 10 days after the surgery, while Hackett was still in a hospital bed under German watch, the Dutch resistance came for him. They moved him out in civilian clothes through a back corridor. He was thin enough that nobody on the street looked twice. They walked him through the streets of Arnhem in daylight. Then they put him on a small cart and drove him into the countryside. They handed him over to 4 women. Mien, Anna, and Cor de Nooij were 3 unmarried sisters. Their widowed sister Snoek de Nooij lived with them in a country house outside Ada. They were known to the resistance. They had been hiding people since the early years of the occupation. They took Hackett in without asking how long he would stay. He stayed for months. He was so weak when he arrived that he could not climb the stairs. The sisters carried him up. They fed him soup. They washed his wound. They read to him in the evenings when his English was the only language he had energy for. The Dutch winter outside was the hardest winter in living memory. People were eating tulip bulbs in the cities to stay alive. The sisters somehow kept Hackett fed. By the end of January 1945, the British general could stand up again. He could walk. He could speak. He could not stay. On the 30th of January 1945, Hackett left the de Nooij sisters' house with a forged Dutch identity card. The name on the card was Mr. van der Laan. On the reverse, the card carried a special notice. The bearer was deaf and could not respond to questions. This was the resistance's solution to the most obvious problem. Hackett spoke fluent German and decent French, but no Dutch. His first word at a checkpoint would have sentenced him to a firing squad. The deaf badge meant that any German guard who tried to question him would meet only blank silence and a finger pointed at the card. He left the house on a bicycle, in borrowed Dutch clothing, in the snow. He cycled across the country. The route ran through Groothammers to a town called Sliedrecht, on the northern bank of a stretch of water that would become his last problem. South of the water lay liberated territory, Allied lines. British uniforms, friends. North of the water lay the Germans, still in charge, still shooting anyone who crossed without permission. The water in question was the Biesbosch, a vast wetland of channels, reeds, and small islands, frozen and half-frozen depending on the night. The Biesbosch had become a no-man's land. The Germans patrolled it, the resistance moved through it. Boats crossed at night carrying people and medicines and folded documents, and not all of those boats came back. Hackett's boatman, his Biesbosch crosser, was a man named Koos Meijer. On the night of the 3rd of February 1945, a few days after Hackett arrived in Sliedrecht, Koos Meijer was waiting for him at the water's edge. Koos had done this dozens of times. He had a small wooden boat and an oar, and the kind of nerve a man develops when he has already lost friends doing the same work. Hackett later wrote about that night. He thanked Aunt Mean for the thick woolen sweater she had given him for the journey. He thanked her for the long underwear. He climbed into the boat. He felt strong hands push them off into the dark. The wind picked up over the water. The boat moved fast. The foam from the oars sprayed Hackett in the face. The cold came in through his shoes. He untied his shoelaces so he could move his toes because he could no longer feel his feet. Koos rowed. The general held on. Neither man spoke. Boats on the Biesbosch did not survive conversation. They reached the southern bank near a harbour at Drimmelen, on the liberated side. Hackett looked up and saw what every British soldier in those weeks had been waiting to see. British uniforms, British equipment, a British accent calling to him from the dock. He climbed up out of the boat and into the cold air of a country he was finally on his own side of. Koos came up after him. The two men looked at each other in proper daylight for the first time. Hackett had carried a packet of cigarettes with him through the entire journey out of Arnhem, Player's Navy cut, his last pack. He pressed it into Koos's hand and signed the wrapper with the only writing the roll would ever have of him. Koos kept that packet for the rest of his life. A Dutch film crew made a documentary in 1967 called Grensrechters in de Biesbosch, Border Guards in the Biesbosch. It was about the men who had rowed across the wetland in the last winter of the war. Two of those men, Kees van der Sand and Arie van Driel, had been executed by the Germans for doing it. The film told their story too. The crew brought Hackett over from England to meet Koos again. 22 years had passed. The two men stood on the same harbour at Drimmelen. Koos took out the cigarette packet. The signature was still there. The British general took it in his hands. He could not speak for a long time. In 2012, after Hackett's death, his family donated a porcelain dish he had been given by the Dutch Air Force Association in his honour to the Biesbosch Museum. The dish sits today in a glass case next to the canoe used by the Biesbosch crossers. Next to the dish is a packet of Player's Navy cut, signed. Hackett went on to a long career. He commanded the British Army of the Rhine. He became a knight. He wrote books. He died on the 9th of September 1997. He was the last surviving general of the Battle of Arnhem. He outlived almost every man who had jumped onto the heath with him in 1944. He never outlived the night on the water. That is all for this one. If the Biesbosch crosses stuck with you, hit subscribe. War Stories After Dark is going to keep finding the boatmen, the nurses, and the backroad heroes the official histories never wrote into the index. Drop a comment about a wartime escape that deserves an episode, and share this one with someone who would want to know what a packet of cigarettes can mean for 50 years.